If the ego creates suffering in relationships, what does love look like without ego? What happens when connection is no longer based on possession, validation, or psychological dependency? Buddhism offers an extraordinary possibility: love without clinging. A form of love that is deeply compassionate yet inwardly free. And understanding this may completely transform the way we think about relationships forever. Most people spend their entire lives searching for love. Not success, not money, not even happiness, but love. The feeling that somewhere in this world there is another person who can finally make us feel complete. And at first, love does feel that way. When someone enters our life and truly sees us, something inside us softens. The noise in the mind becomes quieter. The loneliness fades for a moment. Even ordinary things suddenly feel meaningful again. A text message can change our mood. A voice can calm our anxiety. A single person can begin to feel like the center of our emotional universe. And this is why losing love hurts so deeply. Because when attachment forms, the mind slowly begins to believe something dangerous. I cannot be whole without this person. Buddhism begins its understanding of love with this uncomfortable truth. Most human love is mixed with attachment. Not because humans are evil, not because love itself is wrong, but because the mind clings. And wherever the mind clings, suffering quietly begins. The Buddha did not reject love. He rejected the illusion hidden inside attachment. The illusion that another human being can permanently satisfy the deepest hunger inside us. And perhaps this is why so many relationships begin with excitement, but slowly become filled with fear. Fear of losing, fear of changing, fear of abandonment, fear of no longer being enough. Because attachment transforms love into psychological dependency, and dependency always creates suffering. But to understand this fully, we must first understand something deeper about the human mind. Why are humans so desperate to be loved in the first place? Why does rejection feel almost physical? Why does heartbreak feel like death? Why can one person have so much power over our emotions? Buddhist psychology has an answer, and the answer begins with emptiness. Not physical emptiness, psychological emptiness. A silent feeling that something inside us is incomplete. Most people spend their lives trying to escape this feeling. Some escape through achievement, some through distraction, some through status, pleasure, or ambition. But many escape through relationships. Love becomes emotional anesthesia. Another person becomes a shield against loneliness, insecurity, uncertainty, and self-confrontation. This is why falling in love can feel intoxicating, because for a brief moment, the separate self feels dissolved. The anxious mind relaxes. The inner emptiness feels filled. The fear of being alone disappears. But Buddhism asks a difficult question. If another person can make you feel whole, why does their absence make you collapse? Because what we often call love is not pure connection. It is attachment layered over emotional need, and attachment always carries fear. This is one of the most important psychological insights in Buddhism. The stronger the attachment, the stronger the fear hidden beneath it. A person who clings deeply must constantly fear loss. This is why attachment creates anxiety even inside happy relationships. Most people think anxiety only appears after problems begin. But Buddhist psychology says the anxiety was already there from the start, hidden underneath desire. The moment the mind says, "I need this person," fear has already entered the relationship. Because the mind now has something to lose, and the human mind struggles immensely with loss, especially emotional loss. This is why people become possessive, why jealousy appears, why overthinking begins, why small changes suddenly feel threatening. A delayed text message becomes emotional danger. A colder tone becomes possible rejection. A small distance becomes panic. The mind begins scanning constantly for signs of abandonment, not because people are irrational, but because attachment activates survival fear. In Buddhist psychology, attachment is not merely emotional, it becomes identity. The relationship slowly merges with the self. My partner, my relationship, my future, my happiness. Notice the language. The ego transforms connection into possession. And once possession appears, suffering follows naturally, because reality itself is unstable. People change, feelings change, bodies age, circumstances shift, emotions rise and fall, nothing remains fixed. This is one of the central teachings of Buddhism, impermanence. Everything changes, not eventually, constantly. And yet the human mind desperately wants permanence from impermanent things, especially in love. We want feelings to stay the same forever. We want passion to remain untouched by time. We want emotional certainty in an uncertain world. But Buddhism says suffering begins the moment we demand permanence from life, because life cannot obey that demand, and relationships cannot either. This is why many people are not actually in love with another human being. They are in love with a mental image, an image of who the person was, who they should be, who they must remain. But human beings are flowing processes, not fixed identities. And this creates one of the deepest tragedies in relationships. People try to freeze each other psychologically. They stop seeing the living person and begin clinging to memory instead. This is why relationships often become painful over time. Not because love disappeared, but because attachment resists change. One partner evolves, the other resists. One grows emotionally, the other clings to an old version of them. And slowly, suffering emerges, not from love itself, but from resistance. The Buddha observed this everywhere in human life. Humans suffer not because life changes. Humans suffer because they demand that life should not change. And nowhere is this more visible than in romantic love. At the beginning of relationships, people rarely notice this mechanism, because early attraction creates psychological intoxication. Modern neuroscience even confirms this. Romantic attraction activates many of the same reward systems involved in addiction. Dopamine rises. Craving intensifies. Attention narrows. The beloved becomes psychologically magnified. This is why people in love often become obsessed. The mind begins revolving around one person. Thoughts become repetitive. Emotional dependency deepens. Identity slowly reorganizes around attachment. And the more emotionally dependent the mind becomes, the more fragile it becomes. This is why relationships can produce both euphoria and suffering with incredible intensity. A loving message creates emotional highs. Distance creates emotional withdrawal. The mind swings constantly between pleasure and fear. Buddhism recognized this cycle thousands of years ago. Craving creates suffering, not because desire itself is immoral, but because craving chains emotional stability to external conditions, and external conditions always change. This is why even happy relationships contain hidden suffering. Because deep down, the mind knows nothing can be permanently held. Not youth, not beauty, not passion, not certainty, not people. And yet humans continue trying. This creates a subtle tension beneath attachment, a constant fear of impermanence. Sometimes this fear appears as jealousy, sometimes as control, sometimes as emotional neediness, sometimes as silent anxiety. But beneath all of them lies the same psychological truth. The mind is terrified of losing what it clings to. And ironically, this fear itself often damages relationships, because fear changes behavior. The more attached people become, the more they often seek reassurance, overanalyze emotions, monitor changes, control outcomes, demand certainty. But certainty is impossible in human relationships. No person can guarantee permanent emotional security, not because they do not love us, but because they are human, changing, impermanent, vulnerable, just like us. This is why Buddhism does not teach detachment as emotional coldness. This is a major misunderstanding. The Buddha was not teaching people to stop loving. He was teaching people how to love without clinging, without turning another person into psychological survival, without making love the sole foundation of identity, without demanding permanence from impermanent things. This kind of love is radically different from attachment. Attachment says, "You complete me." Wisdom says, "I care for you deeply, but I do not own you." Attachment says, "Never change." Wisdom says, "I understand that all things change." Attachment says, "If I lose you, I lose myself." Wisdom says, "I can love fully without collapsing into dependency." This is why Buddhist love is often misunderstood by modern culture. Modern culture romanticizes emotional fusion. The idea that two people should become everything for each other. That love means constant emotional reassurance, constant validation, constant certainty. But Buddhist psychology sees danger in this. Because when identity fuses too deeply with another person, suffering becomes inevitable. The relationship becomes burdened with impossible expectations. One person must now remove loneliness, provide meaning, stabilize insecurity, heal emotional wounds, prevent existential emptiness. No human being can sustain that role forever, and eventually cracks appear. This is why many relationships slowly shift from love into resentment, because hidden expectations eventually collide with reality. The partner fails to permanently satisfy emotional hunger, and the mind reacts with disappointment. But Buddhism says the problem was never the other person. The problem was the illusion that another person could permanently eliminate inner suffering. This illusion creates endless cycles. People fall in love, become attached, experience fear, try to control, become disappointed, suffer, separate, then begin again with someone new, believing the next relationship will finally solve the deeper problem. But Buddhist psychology says the deeper problem is internal. The mind itself is attached. And until attachment is understood, suffering repeats itself in different forms. This does not mean relationships are meaningless. Far from it. Relationships can become profound paths of awareness. They reveal the hidden structure of the ego. Nothing exposes attachment faster than love. Nothing reveals insecurity faster than intimacy. Nothing uncovers fear faster than emotional closeness. Love becomes a mirror showing us our fears, our cravings, our dependency, our loneliness, our attachment to identity. And this is why heartbreak can sometimes awaken people spiritually. Because loss shatters illusion. When attachment breaks, the mind is suddenly forced to confront itself directly. The distraction disappears, and underneath the grief, people often discover something terrifying. They do not know who they are without attachment. This is why breakups often feel like identity collapse, not merely emotional pain, psychological disorientation, because the self had unconsciously fused with another person. Without them, the mind suddenly feels empty. But Buddhism says this emptiness is not punishment. It is revelation. The relationship did not create completeness. It temporarily distracted the mind from incompleteness, and once the distraction vanished, the deeper suffering resurfaced. This is difficult to hear, because humans desperately want love to save them. Movies teach it, songs repeat it, culture worships it. But Buddhism offers a radically different vision. Love cannot permanently save us from ourselves. Only understanding can. And this changes the entire meaning of relationships. Instead of using love to escape loneliness, love becomes a place where awareness deepens. Instead of demanding emotional completion from another person, we learn to observe the craving for completion itself. Instead of clinging to permanence, we learn how to love within impermanence. And perhaps this is the real beginning of wisdom in relationships. Not finding someone who removes suffering forever, but understanding the mechanisms that create suffering in the first place. Because once attachment is seen clearly, love itself begins to change. It becomes less possessive, less fearful, less controlling, and strangely, more genuine. But this raises another question. If attachment is the source of suffering in love, why do humans become attached so easily? Why does the mind cling so desperately to emotional connection? To answer this, we must go deeper into Buddhist psychology, deeper into the structure of the self. Because according to Buddhism, the root of attachment is not merely emotional need. It is the illusion of identity itself, and this illusion shapes every relationship we enter. If attachment creates suffering in love, then what exactly is attachment attached to? At first, the answer seems obvious. Another person, their attention, their affection, their presence, their validation. But Buddhist psychology says something far more unsettling. Most attachment is not actually attachment to another person. It is attachment to the self we become around them. And this changes everything. Because beneath every relationship lies a hidden psychological structure: identity. The mind is constantly constructing a story about who we are. I am lovable. I am important. I am wanted. I matter to someone. Relationships do not simply connect two people emotionally. They reinforce identity. This is why romantic love can feel so psychologically powerful. Because being loved temporarily stabilizes the fragile self. When someone desires us, the ego expands. When someone chooses us, the mind feels significant. When someone admires us, insecurity quiets down for a moment. Love becomes psychological confirmation, proof that the self is valuable. And this is why rejection hurts so deeply. Not only because we lose a person, but because the identity built around that relationship suddenly begins collapsing. Buddhist psychology views this collapse very differently from modern culture. Most people think heartbreak is purely emotional pain, but often heartbreak is also ego disintegration. The mind loses the version of itself it had become attached to. The desired self, the needed self, the chosen self, the important self. And suddenly, without that reflection from another person, identity becomes unstable again. This is why people after breakups often ask questions like, was any of it real? Why wasn't I enough? Who am I now? Notice how quickly love becomes self-worth. This is the hidden mechanism Buddhism points toward again and again. Humans use relationships to reinforce identity, but identity itself is unstable. In Buddhism, this instability is deeply connected to the teaching of non-self, one of the most misunderstood ideas in all of Buddhism. When people hear non-self, they often imagine something cold or abstract. But Buddhist psychology is incredibly practical. The Buddha was observing something direct and human. What we call the self is not fixed. It is a constantly changing process. Thoughts change, emotions change, desires change, memories change, personality changes. Even the body changes continuously, and yet the mind desperately wants to believe there is a permanent me. Why? Because permanence feels safe. A stable identity gives the illusion of control. But Buddhism says the self is more like a flowing river than a solid object, always moving, always shifting. And relationships become one of the primary places where this illusion of a fixed self is maintained. Think about how people behave in relationships. They create identities together. The loyal partner, the successful couple, the emotionally needed person, the attractive one, the caretaker, the victim, the strong one. Over time, these identities become deeply reinforced, and the mind begins clinging to them. This is why relationships can become psychologically rigid. People are no longer relating openly in the present moment. They are defending identities, and once identity enters love, ego enters with it. Suddenly, every disagreement becomes personal. Every criticism feels threatening. Every distance feels dangerous. Every change feels destabilizing. because the ego experiences relational instability as self-instability. This explains why seemingly small conflicts can trigger massive emotional reactions. Sometimes people are not reacting to what was said. They are reacting to what the situation means about who they believe they are. A delayed response might unconsciously mean, "I'm not important." A disagreement might feel like, "I'm losing control." A partner needing space might trigger, "I'm being abandoned." The external event is often small, but the identity attached to it is enormous. This is why Buddhist psychology places such emphasis on awareness. Without awareness, people confuse emotional reactions with objective reality. The mind creates stories instantly. "They don't love me anymore." "I'm not enough." "They're losing interest." "I'm being rejected." And once these stories appear, the body reacts as if they are true. Anxiety rises. Fear intensifies. Defensiveness appears. But Buddhism asks a radical question. Who exactly is being threatened? If the self is unstable and constantly changing, then what is the ego protecting so desperately? This is where Buddhist psychology becomes extraordinarily deep. The ego is not a thing. It is a process of psychological identification. The mind continuously attaches to thoughts, roles, emotions, stories, memories, desires, and calls them me. Relationships intensify this process dramatically, because another human being becomes a mirror reflecting identity back to us. This is why praise feels addictive. When someone says, "You're amazing," "You're special," "I need you," the ego strengthens. The self-story becomes more convincing, and the mind begins craving more reinforcement. This is one reason romantic love can become emotionally intoxicating. Not merely because of affection, but because the ego feels enlarged. The self suddenly feels more complete. But the problem is that identity built on external validation is inherently fragile. Because external validation can disappear at any moment. People change their feelings. Attention shifts. Relationships evolve. And when validation weakens, insecurity rushes back in. This creates one of the most painful cycles in relationships. The more unstable the inner self feels, the more desperately the mind seeks reassurance from others. But reassurance only works temporarily. Soon the anxiety returns. Then, more reassurance is needed, more attention, more affection, more certainty, and slowly, love transforms into emotional dependency. This is why some people become obsessed with texts, responses, and emotional signals. They are not merely seeking connection. They are seeking identity stabilization. Another person becomes responsible for regulating self-worth. But no human being can carry that burden forever. Eventually, exhaustion appears. One partner feels emotionally overwhelmed. The other feels emotionally neglected, and both suffer. Buddhism says this suffering does not arise because humans are incapable of love. It arises because the ego keeps trying to use love to complete itself. But the ego itself is unstable, and anything built upon instability eventually produces fear. This is why so much romantic suffering revolves around validation. People desperately want to feel chosen, prioritized, irreplaceable, admired, emotionally secure. But underneath these desires lies a deeper fear. I am not enough on my own. This fear often begins long before relationships. Childhood conditioning, loneliness, emotional neglect, social comparison, past rejection. The mind accumulates wounds, and then relationships become attempts to heal those wounds externally. At first, this can feel beautiful. Two people comfort each other, support each other, create safety together. But when healing becomes dependency, suffering begins quietly, because now the relationship is no longer simply connection. It becomes psychological survival. This is why people often stay in unhealthy relationships far longer than they should. From the outside, it looks irrational, but internally the mind feels terrified. Because leaving the relationship threatens identity itself. Without the relationship, who am I? Am I still lovable? Am I still valuable? Am I still wanted? The ego experiences separation almost like psychological death. And this is why people tolerate enormous suffering to avoid abandonment. Not because pain feels good, but because identity collapse feels worse. Buddhist psychology sees this mechanism everywhere. Humans cling not only to pleasure, but to familiar identity, even painful identity. This is why some people repeatedly enter toxic relationships. The suffering is familiar. The emotional patterns are familiar. The identity feels familiar, and familiarity creates attachment, even when it hurts. This explains why heartbreak can produce such confusion. People often miss relationships that made them miserable, not because the relationship was healthy, but because the ego had become dependent on the identity inside it. Without the relationship, the self suddenly feels undefined, and the mind struggles immensely with uncertainty. One of Buddhism's deepest observations is that humans fear groundlessness. The ego wants solidity, a fixed self, a fixed future, a fixed emotional reality. But life refuses to remain fixed, and relationships reveal this constantly. People evolve, desires change, needs shift, emotions fluctuate. Nothing stays frozen. This is why clinging creates tension. The mind keeps trying to secure what cannot ultimately be secured, and modern culture intensifies this suffering dramatically. Because modern love is filled with ego reinforcement. Social media especially magnifies identity attachment. People no longer simply experience relationships. They perform them. The relationship becomes part of the public self. Photos, captions, anniversaries, status updates. Love becomes intertwined with image, and once image dominates relationships, comparison inevitably follows. Are we as happy as them? Do they still desire me? Am I attractive enough? Why does their relationship seem better? The ego constantly measures itself against others. This creates endless dissatisfaction, because comparison is one of the ego's primary survival mechanisms. The self constantly seeks superiority, validation, or reassurance through external contrast. But Buddhist psychology says comparison strengthens suffering, because comparison strengthens identification with the self-image. And self-image is never stable. No amount of praise permanently fixes insecurity. No amount of attention permanently removes fear. This is why even attractive, successful, admired people often feel deeply anxious in love. Externally, they appear desired. Internally, the ego still fears insufficiency, because ego hunger cannot truly be satisfied through external approval. It always wants more. More certainty, more admiration, more reassurance. And relationships become emotionally exhausting when they are forced to feed endless ego hunger. This is why Buddhism does not merely ask, "How do we keep love?" It asks, "What part of ourselves is seeking love so desperately?" The question changes everything, because now relationships become pathways into self-understanding, not just emotional fulfillment. The Buddha was deeply interested in observing the mind directly, not intellectually, experientially. And if you observe carefully during moments of jealousy, fear, or rejection, something fascinating appears. The suffering often comes less from the external situation, and more from the story the ego creates around it. Imagine a partner becomes emotionally distant. Immediately, the mind begins producing interpretations. They don't care anymore. I'm losing them. I'm not enough. Then, emotional suffering intensifies. But Buddhist mindfulness invites another approach. Observe the reaction itself. Observe the fear. Observe the grasping. Observe the craving for reassurance, without immediately becoming it. This is profoundly important, because awareness creates psychological space between consciousness and ego reaction. Instead of automatically identifying with fear, we begin witnessing it. And once fear is witnessed clearly, something surprising happens. its power weakens. This is why mindfulness transforms relationships. Not because it removes all emotional pain, but because it prevents unconscious identification from completely controlling behavior. Without awareness, fear becomes action instantly. Fear becomes control. Fear becomes jealousy. Fear becomes emotional manipulation. Fear becomes clinging. But with awareness, people begin seeing the mechanism directly. I am afraid. I am seeking validation. I am clinging to certainty. I am trying to stabilize my identity through another person. This honesty is difficult because the ego prefers blame. It is easier to believe they are causing my suffering than to observe my attachment is creating suffering. But Buddhism repeatedly points inward, not to encourage passivity, not to deny unhealthy relationships, but to reveal how much suffering originates from unconscious identification. This is why two people can experience the exact same relationship situation very differently. One becomes consumed by insecurity, the other remains emotionally grounded. The external event is identical. The internal attachment differs. And this is where love begins transforming into spiritual practice. Relationships stop being merely emotional transactions. They become mirrors, exposing the hidden structure of the self. Every trigger reveals attachment. Every fear reveals clinging. Every jealousy reveals insecurity. Every craving reveals dependency. Love exposes the ego more ruthlessly than almost anything else in life, because intimacy removes distraction. Another person gets close enough to touch the fragile parts we normally hide, and when those fragile parts are touched, unconscious suffering surfaces. This is why relationships can feel both beautiful and terrifying. They awaken longing for connection, while simultaneously exposing fear of vulnerability. The ego desperately wants intimacy, but also fears losing control. This creates contradiction. People want love deeply, yet fear surrendering emotionally. They want connection, yet fear rejection. They want certainty inside an impermanent world. And Buddhism says this contradiction cannot be solved externally. The ego as a partner can permanently remove existential insecurity, because insecurity originates in attachment to the self itself. This does not mean we stop loving. It means love changes form, less possession, less control, less identity hunger, more awareness, more presence, more compassion. But this raises another question. If the ego creates suffering in relationships, what does love look like without ego? What happens when connection is no longer based on possession, validation, or psychological dependency? Buddhism offers an extraordinary possibility. Love without clinging. A form of love that is deeply compassionate, yet inwardly free. And understanding this may completely transform the way we think about relationships forever. If attachment creates suffering, and if the ego turns love into dependency, then a difficult question naturally appears. What does it actually mean to love without attachment? For many people, the idea sounds impossible, or worse, cold. Modern culture often assumes attachment and love are the same thing. If you truly love someone, you should need them, miss them constantly, fear losing them, want them forever. But Buddhism challenges this assumption completely. The Buddha did not teach people to stop caring. He taught people to stop clinging. And there's a profound difference between the two. Clinging says, "You belong to me." Love says, "I cherish your existence." Clinging says, "You must make me feel complete." Love says, "I care for you without demanding that you heal my emptiness." Clinging is rooted in fear. Love is rooted in awareness. This distinction changes the entire psychological structure of relationships, because most suffering in love does not come from caring deeply. It comes from attachment to outcome, attachment to permanence, attachment to control, attachment to emotional certainty. The mind wants guarantees, but love cannot survive as a guarantee. It can only survive as a living experience, and living things change. This is why Buddhism places such enormous importance on acceptance of impermanence, not as pessimism, but as freedom. When people resist impermanence, relationships become filled with tension. The mind constantly asks, will this last? Will they leave? Will their feelings change? What if I lose them? But these questions can never be answered permanently. No relationship comes with absolute certainty, and the more desperately the mind seeks certainty, the more anxiety it creates. This is why attachment often suffocates love. The fear of loss becomes stronger than the joy of connection. People begin controlling each other emotionally, monitoring behavior, demanding reassurance, trying to secure permanence through pressure. But fear cannot create genuine closeness. It only creates emotional imprisonment. Buddhist psychology sees this clearly. The tighter the mind grips, the more suffering appears, because clinging and fear are inseparable. This is why learning to love without attachment begins with learning how to tolerate uncertainty, which is incredibly difficult for the human mind. Humans want emotional stability in a changing world, but Buddhism teaches something radical. Peace does not come from controlling impermanence. Peace comes from understanding it. This understanding changes the quality of love itself. Instead of trying to freeze relationships in place, we begin experiencing them more fully in the present moment. This is one reason mindfulness is so central in Buddhist relationships. Most people are not actually present with the people they love. They are trapped in memory, expectation, fear, projection, comparison. The mind constantly moves away from direct experience. A person may be sitting beside their partner physically, while mentally replaying old arguments or worrying about the future. Attachment pulls consciousness out of the present moment, because attachment is obsessed with securing permanence. But mindful love returns attention to what is actually here now, this moment, this conversation, this shared experience, not the fantasy of forever, and strangely, this often deepens intimacy far more than clinging ever could, because people feel most loved when they are truly seen, not possessed. There is another misconception about Buddhist love that must be understood carefully. People sometimes think non-attachment means emotional distance, as if enlightenment requires becoming detached from human connection. But Buddhism does not teach emotional numbness. In fact, Buddhist compassion is extraordinarily deep. The difference is that compassion does not demand ownership. This is beautifully expressed through the Buddhist concept of metta, often translated as loving kindness. Metta is not based on possession. It is the sincere wish for another being to experience happiness and freedom from suffering. Notice how different this is from attachment-based love. Attachment often says, "I love you because of how you make me feel." But compassionate love says, "I genuinely care about your well-being, even when conditions change, even when emotions fluctuate, even when life becomes uncertain." This kind of love is less dramatic than attachment, but it is far more stable. Attachment is intense because it is mixed with craving, and craving creates emotional highs and lows. This is why some relationships feel addictive. The mind becomes dependent on emotional stimulation. Periods of closeness create euphoria. Periods of distance create anxiety. The relationship becomes psychologically consuming. People mistake this intensity for deep love. But Buddhism warns that intensity and wisdom are not the same thing. Sometimes emotional chaos feels powerful precisely because attachment is so strong. The ego interprets obsession as passion, but genuine love often feels quieter, more spacious, more grounded, less controlling. It allows another person to exist as they are, without trying to turn them into emotional property. This is one of the hardest lessons in relationships, because the ego desperately wants ownership. It wants certainty that another person will stay, will not change, will not leave, will continue validating the self. But no human being can promise this completely. And once we truly understand this, something surprising happens. Love becomes more honest. The illusion of permanence softens, and appreciation deepens. Because impermanence gives relationships fragility, and fragility gives them beauty. Imagine holding water in your hands. The tighter you squeeze, the faster it escapes. But if you hold it gently, it remains longer. Buddhism teaches relationships in a similar way. Love cannot survive excessive grasping. It requires openness, trust, presence, and inner stability. This inner stability is crucial, because without it, relationships become emotional survival systems. The mind constantly seeks rescue from loneliness, insecurity, boredom, or emptiness. Another person becomes medicine for unresolved suffering. But Buddhism teaches that true freedom cannot come from dependency. Why? Because dependency creates fear. If your emotional stability completely depends on another person, then your peace becomes fragile. Any shift in the relationship threatens psychological collapse. This is why Buddhism emphasizes inner awareness so strongly, not to make people isolated, but to help them stop outsourcing their entire emotional existence. A person who cannot sit peacefully alone will often cling desperately in relationships, not because they are weak, but because silence exposes unresolved suffering. Many people fear being alone not because solitude itself is painful, but because solitude removes distraction. Without constant stimulation, the mind encounters itself directly, its fears, its loneliness, its emptiness. And relationships can become ways of escaping this confrontation. But Buddhist practice gently turns people back toward themselves. Meditation, mindfulness, and awareness reveal something important. Emotions rise and fall naturally. Thoughts rise and fall naturally. Fear rises and falls naturally. Nothing remains permanent. Even heartbreak changes over time. This insight is deeply liberating, because people begin realizing they are capable of surviving emotional pain without collapsing entirely. This weakens attachment, not because love disappears, but because fear loses some of its control. And when fear weakens, relationships become healthier. There is less need to control, manipulate, possess, demand reassurance constantly. Instead, love becomes more spacious. This spaciousness allows authenticity. People no longer need to perform constantly for validation. They no longer need to maintain perfect images. They can simply be human, vulnerable, changing, imperfect. And paradoxically, this often creates deeper intimacy than ego-driven attachment ever could, because ego relationships are exhausting. Two frightened selves constantly trying to secure certainty from each other. Two egos demanding validation. Two wounded identities seeking completion externally. Eventually, pressure builds, but awareness changes the entire dynamic. When people begin observing their own attachment patterns, something extraordinary happens. They stop expecting another person to permanently solve internal suffering. This does not mean relationships lose meaning. It means relationships stop carrying impossible psychological burdens. And this allows love to breathe. One of the most beautiful aspects of Buddhist psychology is that it transforms relationships into opportunities for awakening. Every moment of jealousy becomes a chance to observe insecurity. Every moment of clinging becomes a chance to observe fear. Every moment of emotional pain becomes a chance to understand the mind more deeply. Instead of automatically blaming others, awareness asks, What attachment inside me is creating this suffering? This question changes relationships completely, because responsibility returns inward, not as self-blame, but as understanding, and understanding weakens unconscious patterns. This is why mindfulness can interrupt cycles that normally destroy relationships. Imagine an argument. Without awareness, emotional reaction escalates automatically. A hurt feeling becomes anger. Anger becomes accusation. Accusation becomes defensiveness. Soon, both people are no longer communicating. They are protecting ego identities, but mindfulness creates a pause. A moment where awareness notices. I feel threatened. I want validation. I am afraid. This pause is profoundly transformative because suffering often continues through unconscious reaction. Awareness interrupts that momentum, and over time, people become less controlled by emotional impulses, not emotionless, simply less enslaved by automatic attachment. This is where compassion naturally grows, because once we observe our own fear and insecurity clearly, we begin understanding others more deeply too. We realize everyone is struggling with attachment. Everyone fears loss. Everyone wants connection. Everyone suffers from insecurity. The shared vulnerability softens the heart, and compassion becomes possible. Not sentimental compassion, wise compassion. Compassion that understands human fragility without turning it into dependency. This is why Buddhist love is deeply connected to freedom. Not freedom from caring, freedom from possession. There is a profound difference. Possession says, "You are mine." Compassion says, "You are your own person, and I honor that." Possession fears change. Compassion understands change is inevitable. Possession demands certainty. Compassion remains present even within uncertainty. This kind of love is incredibly rare because most people have never learned emotional stability internally. Modern culture trains people to chase stimulation, validation, and identity reinforcement constantly. But Buddhism trains awareness, and awareness transforms love. It reveals how much suffering comes not from relationships themselves, but from the mind's attempt to control what cannot be controlled. This does not mean relationships become painless. Even deeply aware, people still experience grief. Loss still hurts. Separation still hurts. Goodbyes still hurt. Buddhism never denies human emotion. The difference is that suffering no longer becomes amplified by unconscious clinging. Pain is natural. Psychological imprisonment is optional. This is one of the deepest insights in Buddhist psychology. When attachment weakens, love actually becomes more courageous. Because now people can love without constantly bargaining against reality. They can appreciate another person without demanding permanence. They can care deeply while understanding everything changes. And strangely, this understanding often increases gratitude. Because nothing is guaranteed, every conversation becomes more precious. Every shared moment becomes more alive. Impermanence no longer destroys meaning. It creates meaning. A flower is beautiful, partly because it fades. A sunset is beautiful partly because it disappears. Human relationships are the same. Their fragility is inseparable from their beauty. And perhaps this is what the Buddha was ultimately pointing toward. Not withdrawal from life, but awakening within it. To love consciously instead of unconsciously. To relate without turning another person into psychological property. To experience intimacy without losing ourselves in attachment. To understand that no human being can permanently complete us, because completeness was never something another person could give in the first place. It emerges through awareness, through understanding, through seeing clearly. And when this understanding deepens, something remarkable happens. Love becomes less desperate, less fearful, less possessive, and more compassionate, more present, more free. This is why Buddhism does not ask us to stop loving. It asks us to love without illusion, without the illusion of permanence, without the illusion of ownership, without the illusion that another person can permanently rescue us from ourselves. And perhaps that is the deepest form of love possible. Not clinging, not possession, not dependency, but two human beings meeting fully within the fragile impermanence of life, with open eyes and open hearts.